Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Some Stops Along the Way, your podcast that highlights some of the most interesting countries in the world, looking at their history, culture, geopolitics through the lens of the people that I've interacted with in those countries during my career and some of the experiences that I've had there. Today, we're starting in on a new country, one called Colombia, which I'm sure all of you have heard of. Uh, it is the only time in my career that I worked in South America, and it was really almost an accident. Typically, unless you are a fluent Spanish or Portuguese speaker, your opportunities to work in South America are rather limited. But because of my specialty in economic growth, I had the chance to go to Colombia on a business development assignment to really scope out potential opportunities for my company. And so it was not my language skills that brought me there, certainly. It was my expertise in an area that they really needed and where a great deal of donor support was being channeled. And so it was a great opportunity for me to visit this fascinating country that, I'll be very honest, up until I did that, I had a skewed perception of Colombia, as many of you might have, because I had largely seen what was on the news, and my perspective, therefore, was much narrower in scope than it should have been. When I visited the country and actually interacted with the people, I was able, at least tertiarily, to scratch off some of that veneer and see what the country was really all about. And I want to share some of that with you today, along with the history, the culture, and the geopolitics of the country. My discussion of Colombia is one chapter in my memoir, Some Stops Along the Way. It's the final chapter in the section called Hope and Hopelessness. And I hope that you will check that out. So Colombia is a country really that shouldn't have happened in my career. But again, that door opened and I walked through it. But I don't think that this episode would be very substantial in helping you understand this country without really delving into its history and geopolitics. And so I want to do that here in just a few moments. First of all, though, have you noticed my shirt? I'm rocking the 4-6's Ranch shirt. 4-6's Ranch is in Texas. It's one of the largest ranches down there, and they not only have a bunch of interesting things to see and do and cool cowboys, they also rock a nice clothing line, which I like a lot. So if you ever are in Texas and get the chance to check out the 4-6's, please do so. And that's not a paid advertisement, by the way. 4-6's paid me nothing. I just like the place and wanted to call it out for you today. Let's talk a little bit more about Colombia. Let's start with its history. The Colombian mainland is bordered by the Caribbean Sea to the north. Then it has Venezuela on its east and northeastern borders, Brazil to its southeast, Peru and Ecuador to the south and southwest, the Pacific Ocean to the west, and Panama to the northwest. It's been the home of indigenous cultures since at least 12,000 BC. But one of the seminal events in the history of Colombia was when the Spanish conquistadors arrived in 1499. And with that arrival brought the emergence of the Spanish Empire in that area of the world, which lasted, at least in Colombia's case, until 1810, when what is now Colombia emerged as the United Provinces of New Granada. But the Spanish weren't totally gone. They had a reconquest for a time that lasted until 1819, when Gran Colombia was formed. The new polity experimented with federalism as the Grenadine Federation was formed in 1858, and that lasted until the United States of Colombia was formed in 1863. And finally, Colombia became a centralized republic in 1886. Another seminal event in the history of Colombia happened in 1903, when Panama seceded from the country. This is when the Panama Canal was being built, and the United States actually paid Colombia $25 million in 1921, 7 years after the completion of the canal, for redress of President Roosevelt's role in the creation of Panama. So soon after that period of turbulence, if you will, Panama achieved some degree of political stability. But that was interrupted by a bloody conflict that took place between the late 1940s and early 1950s called La Violencia, the violence. And La Violencia was primarily caused by mounting tensions between the two leading political parties, which subsequently ignited after the assassination of the liberal presidential candidate Jorge Eliezer Gaitán in 1948. The ensuing riots in Bogota, which was known as El Bogotazo, spread throughout the country and claimed the lives of nearly 180,000 Colombians. And this led rise to another seminal time in Colombia's history. This gave rise to the conflict between government forces and armed leftist guerrillas, as well as right-wing paramilitaries. One of these groups we're going to talk about in depth. It was called the Revolutionary Army of Colombia, the FARC. But the conflict escalated throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s, mainly in remote rural areas. Several of the guerrilla organizations began to wane in the late 80s and early 90s, and many demobilized after the peace negotiations between 1989 and 1994. The United States, of course, has been heavily involved in Colombia since at least 1903, with the secession of Panama and then the construction of the Panama Canal. But we began to get very deeply involved in the 1960s with the emergence of especially the left-wing guerrillas in our attack against communism. The United States very much was trying to thwart the spread of communism throughout that area of the world, in Cuba, in Colombia, and in other areas. And so the United States took a special interest in Colombia to try to prevent, if you will, the spread of communism. During this period, mercenaries and multinational corporations such as Chiquita Brand International are some of the international actors that contributed to violence during this period of Colombia's history. And of course, in the 1970s came the emergence of the drug cartels, which led to the rise of the flow of illegal narcotics, including marijuana and cocaine, most of which went to the United States. This emergence of revolutionaries, paramilitaries, narco-traffickers, all of this was a toxic cocktail that destabilized Colombia and made it a breeding ground for most of the nefarious things that the United States was opposed to. Communism, number one, and narco trafficking, number two. It destabilized society to the point where the government at some level really virtually lost control of the hearts and minds of the people, especially in the rural areas. One of the major groups during this time was the FARC. The FARC is almost legendary. It's almost some of the actions around both the rise of the FARC and the things that they were involved in go almost to the absurd. One even wonders whether or not they can be true. Does the legend really match reality? I don't know that any of us will ever know the answer to that. But the FARC stands for, as I said before, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. And it was a far-left Marxist-Lenin guerrilla group that was involved in the Colombian conflict beginning in 1964. When it was officially founded, it was a peasant self-defense group that was formed really because of la violencia, as a peasant force promoting a political line of agrarianism and anti-imperialism. Does this sound familiar? Remember our last episodes on Cambodia. This is what Pol Pot and his henchmen in the Khmer Rouge were trying to do as well. Now, it didn't go as far in Colombia as it did there, but still it created a destabilizing force in society and created a massive conflict over the period of 20 to 25 years that affected every aspect of life in Colombia. The FARC was known for a variety of military tactics in addition to unconventional methods, including terrorism. The operations of the FARC were funded primarily by kidnapping, ransom, mining, and extortion, and taxation of various forms of economic activity and the production and distribution of drugs. It's very hard to talk about the FARC without talking about narco trafficking, because the FARC and the narco traffickers were really almost embedded with each other. The narco traffickers provided funding to the FARC provided protection for the narco traffickers, so there's that symbiotic relationship there. So one might ask, well, why didn't the government just go out and alleviate the problem? Well, there were several reasons for that, but one of the big reasons was that both the FARC and even more so the narco traffickers had won the hearts and minds of a lot of the people in rural areas. For instance, when I was there, I was told by colleagues that much of the infrastructure, like schools, hospitals, etc., in the rural areas especially, were funded not by the government, but by narco traffickers who were taking care of the people. They provided a lifestyle for the people that the government couldn't provide. And so the people began not only to depend on the narco traffickers for their livelihoods, but because of that, they began to support them and protect them and adopt, if not adopt their ideology, at least look the other way when violence happened all around them. The conflict in Colombia was for the hearts and minds of people. And for many years, the FARC and other paramilitary groups and the narco traffickers won those hearts and minds. And it led to some really absurd situations at times. I'll give you an example. When I was there, I traveled to many cities. I traveled to Cali, I traveled to Medellin, I traveled to Bucaramanga, in addition to Bogota. And one morning in Bucaramanga, I had breakfast with a lady who ran a major NGO, national non-governmental organization in Colombia, that provided medical services and also educational services to the most vulnerable people in society, many of who lived in the rural areas. And that meant that she and her team had to often travel to the rural areas in order to provide these services. And she was telling me over breakfast that the situation in the late 70s and early 80s especially got so absurd that it was almost cartoonish. She relayed to me that once she and her team went into the rural areas to provide medical and educational services to the poorest people, the most vulnerable people in these areas, and were almost immediately captured by the FARC. And the FARC detained them in this village, wouldn't allow them to leave. This lasted for almost a month. But then there was a kerfuffle between the FARC and the local narco trafficker. So the narco traffickers ran the FARC out of the village, but the narco traffickers then wouldn't let them leave either. And that lasted around a month and a half. And finally, the armed forces of Colombia found out where they were, came in and had a shootout with the narco traffickers, ran them out of the village. And then the armed forces wouldn't allow she and her team to leave either for another month or so, as they tried to sort out whether or not they were supporting the FARC and the narco traffickers. 3 different groups detained the same people. It was an unbelievable situation. And in those days, my friends in Colombia tell me, it was very hard to determine who was right and who was wrong, because everybody was committing atrocities. The FARC and other paramilitaries were committing widespread atrocities like kidnapping and extortion and other types of violence, including terrorism. The narco traffickers were spilling blood all over the streets of Cali and Medellin and other areas, both fighting against each other and fighting government forces. And the government forces were also involved in widespread atrocities during that period, according to my friends in Colombia. And so one didn't really know who the good guys were. It depended on your perspective. If the narco traffickers were building your school, the school where your child was getting educated, building the hospital where your wife was giving birth, or your mother or father was having surgery, or helping fund your very existence by providing food, by providing protection, then the narco traffickers were the good guys. If the FARC was providing those kind of services of protecting you and your family, then they were the good guys. If the government was protecting you from the narco traffickers and the FARC, then they were the good guys. But they could just as easily have been the bad guys, depending on what perspective you had. It's a convoluted situation. If it sounds convoluted, that's because it is. So the people who lived through this had this amazing perspective and this natural focus on resilience. They did what they had to do to survive. One day my friend Carlos, and it's not his real name, by the way, he asked me not to use his real name for security purposes, but we were driving around Medellin, and we drove by the cemetery, and Carlos asked me at that time, he said, "Do you know who's buried in that cemetery?" I said, "I don't know. I give up." "Who?" He said, "There are two types of people buried in that cemetery. The people who had principles and the people who didn't. The people who had principles are there because they stood up for the things that the FARC and the narco traffickers and even the government didn't appreciate, and so they ended up 6 feet under. The others ended up there because of their lifestyles, their lack of principles, which led them to do various and sundry things that led to their untimely demise." A crazy situation, really. And when you look at the FARC itself, at some point in time, it became less of a revolution and more of a society that was embedded with the narco traffickers, which was not what its founder, Manuel Marulanda Velez Tirafio, I hope I got his name right, had really envisioned. Marulanda, as they called him, died of a heart attack in 2008, and he was replaced by his deputy, Alfonso Cano. Alfonso Cano was killed in 2011 in a fight with the Colombian army, and replaced by Rodrigo Lanando Echeverri, who's called Timochenko. Now, Timochenko is an interesting character because Timochenko was the first FARC commander that really went to the negotiating table with the government. And he was actually instrumental in negotiating the peace deal with the Colombian government in 2015. At that time, the FARC transitioned from a revolutionary group or paramilitary group to a political party. But again, the FARC's demise would have come likely much earlier than that, had it not been for their affiliation with the narco traffickers. The illegal drug trade in Colombia has been on the rise since the 1970s. And it's centered on 4 primary drug trafficking cartels: Medellin, Cali, Norte de Valle, and the North Coast. We'll talk more about those in a minute. The trade eventually created a new social order in Colombia. And we talked about that a little bit. Because you had your very poor and you had your very rich. And the very rich, in many cases, were directly connected to the drug cartels. And the very rich had so much money and so much influence that they even controlled governmental policy. They were very much embedded with many of the politicians in the 1970s and 80s, especially, until their influence became so much of a problem internationally for Colombia that they were forced to do something about it and worked with the United States to do that. But for years, these drug cartels influenced culture, economics, and politics throughout Colombia. You probably know that Colombia is known for being the world's leading producer of coca. The worldwide demand for psychoactive drugs during the 1960s and 1970s resulted in increased production and processing in Colombia. Cocaine, for instance, produced $1,500 a kilo in jungle labs, but could be sold on the streets of the United States for more than $50,000 per kilo. And of course, the United States was the world's largest consumer of these drugs. So the drug barons of Colombia, such as Pablo Escobar and Jose Rodriguez Gacha, were considered by authorities to be among the most dangerous, wealthy, and powerful men in the world. When we look at these drug cartels, one of the most famous is, of course, the Medellin cartel, which basically lasted from 1976 until 1993 and was ruled with an iron fist by a notorious character that we've all heard of called Pablo Escobar. He was killed by Colombian Special Forces in 1993, and that led to really the dismantling of the Medellin cartel. The Cali cartel also operated during roughly that same time period, from 1977 to 1995. It was founded by two brothers, Gilberto and Miguel Rodriguez Ojulia. And Gilberto and Miguel ended up in United States prisons. Gilberto died in prison in the United States. Miguel is still incarcerated in the United States. The Norte de Valle cartel lasted from 1990 until 2012, founded by Diego Leon Montoya Sanchez, who's now serving a 48-year sentence in the United States. And the North Coast cartel, founded by Alberto Orlandez Gamboa, who is called Caracol. He's serving a 40-year sentence in the United States since 2003. So you can see that it's hard to talk about Colombia without talking about the rise and fall of the FARC and other paramilitaries and the narco-traffickers. And I will tell you that the flow of narcotics from Colombia, though much lower than it was, is still significant. The government of Colombia, though much better and much more stable than it was, still struggles with the internal challenges in the country, with both paramilitary groups and with drug cartels. But much of the drug cartel business is now migrated out of Colombia into places like Nicaragua and surrounding countries. But for years, the quality of life in Colombia and surrounding countries was funded largely through the proceeds of illegal narcotics that were being transported and sold in the United States. So this being said, what did all this have to do with me? Why was I in Colombia? Well, I was there to explore opportunities for economic growth in the country that were going to be funded by donor organizations that my company might play a role in implementing. And what I found as I traveled around the country was that the average Colombian was extremely conflicted very few of the people I met embraced the values of the FARC. And yet, they all understood why the FARC existed, because of this huge gap between the political elites and the rest of the country, which had spilled over during La Valencia, the violence in the 1940s and 1950s, and had given rise to groups like the FARC because of the frustration that average people had with their own government. But the people that I met were even more conflicted by the narco traffickers. I was riding through Cali one day with a friend who pointed out, as I said before, hospitals, schools, roads, parks, even churches that were funded by narco traffickers. Children were getting a good education. People were going to houses of worship, enjoying a picnic in parks, because of the philanthropy, if you will, of the narco traffickers. They were doing things for them that the government was not prepared to do. And so my friend, who was a very reasonable person and abhorred the drug trade, would never have used drugs, would never even thought of being involved in that life. But even he said, Mark, look, what are we supposed to do? Number one, we're dealing with very violent people who could care less about life. And so if you oppose them, they can exterminate you just like stepping on a cockroach. But on the other side, they are funding a lifestyle and a livelihood that our families, that are beneficial to our families. The government's not doing that. So what are we to do? It was a very odd conversation to have, and a very interesting perspective, I think, for me in visiting the country and that whole region of the world, if you will, for the first time. I've been in many countries of the world where there have been wide gaps between the government elite and the people, where government policies have failed across the board, where groups have arisen to try to address the inequity in society. But up until that time, I had not seen a case where those that are filling that gap had the kind of mass appeal that especially these narco traffickers had. These men were rock stars. They rode around town with impunity. They weren't afraid of the government. At least for many years they weren't. They weren't afraid of anybody in the community because no one had the nerve to defy them, but also they were paying the bills. So what changed? How did these cartels come undone? Well, it really changed when the pressure on the Colombian government became so great to stop the drug flow, especially to the United States, that it ratcheted up with the United States help and technology from the United States. It ratcheted up the pressure on these drug cartels. As a matter of fact, Pablo Escobar was caught and killed because his phone was tapped by technology that was provided through the United States, and they found his location. They were able to go and a shootout involved, and in trying to escape, Pablo Escobar was killed. But when the heads of these cartels started to be killed, and others were extradited to the United States for long prison sentences, the game really changed. Because if they were incarcerated in Colombia, which many of them had been in the past, they could simply buy their way out of prison. They would find some governmental official or some prison official that would take the money, and even if they were out illegally and on the run, they were out of prison. But in the United States, no such luck. When you were there, and you were likely in Florence, Colorado in the Supermax. So this changed the game and really created the first steps in undermining these cartels. When I was there in the early 2000s, the country was still very much in flux from an economic standpoint. Several of the cartels were still, if not at their peak, certainly had significant influence in the country. And literally, you had no idea when you were talking with people where their loyalties lay. So the last thing that you wanted to do would be to either criticize the government or to criticize the cartels, because especially if you're outside of Bogota, you had no idea how that would be perceived or how that information would be relayed within the community. So I learned very quickly, ask the questions you need to ask, shake your head a lot, gather the information you need to gather, and move on your way, which is exactly what I did. But in doing so, I met some great people, had some amazing experiences. The food in Colombia is wonderful. I would recommend that you visit the country. It's a much safer place now than it was. It's a very dynamic and culturally rich country that has a beautiful countryside outside of Bogota. And the people are very welcoming. But their perception of the world was very much based on their environment. And the environment in which they lived required them to be flexible in their approach to how they viewed the world. I guess the takeaway here is that in the United States, it's easy for us to sit back and watch the news and see what's happening in countries like Colombia and say, and make a rash judgment. Oh, this is a failed state, or the government is weak, or there's a lack of governance. It's easy for us to say those things, especially if we're just watching the news. But if you actually go to these countries, you realize it's much more complicated. There are many layers of the onion that have to be peeled back. And even then, no one who hasn't lived that life can really understand the realities of living in that situation. So, that's a little bit about my time in Colombia. You can read more and some stops along the way. I wish that I'd had the chance to work more in South America, but if I couldn't work if I couldn't work anywhere else on that continent, I'm glad it was Colombia, because I feel like my time there was very significant. And as I said, I have friends that will last a lifetime. Thanks for joining some stops along the way. I hope you learned something about Colombia today that you didn't know, and I hope to see you next time.